So, buongiorno a tutti. So I'm supposed to be talking this morning about my journey. Normally I don't talk about this because it's all in the past and, you know, it's a last life experience. But since this is what this conference is about, and they said particularly to speak on it, I will do so in brief. So I was born in England during the war, and my mother was a spiritualist, which meant that every week we had seances in our house, speaking with local spirits and having tables sailing around the room and so forth. This was a very good experience for me because it happened in our own house, so I knew there was no faking. It was just the neighbors, one of whom was psychic. And it gave me from my early childhood the very clear acknowledgement of death and the question, what happens then? So this was, I think, we weren't afraid of death. Death was a very happy, everyday breakfast conversation. But then what? You know, and the knowledge that something does go on and how we use this lifetime is very important for where we will be going on to next. So that was my basic. I was brought up in London. Since very early childhood, I had believed that we were innately perfect and that we were here to rediscover our inherent perfection, and that we had to keep coming back again and again and again until we returned to who we really were. So therefore, as a child, my main question was, what is perfection and how do we attain it? And so I asked many people, I asked priests, I asked teachers, I asked my mother, I even asked the spirit guides. And all of them said, you have to be good. And some said, you have to be good and you have to be kind. But even as a child, I knew that wasn't it. Yes, of course we have to be good and we have to be kind. But I knew good, kind people. They were not perfect. What was this other thing which we needed that was our true nature? What was that? And in the West at that time, there were no answers, none that were given to me at least. So the other point from my childhood which influenced my path was that I am by nature non-theistic. I don't believe, I've never felt any sense of connection with the idea of a creator God. So that also cut out most of the religions which were available. And I thought I have to find my own path. But when I was 18, fortunately, I came across a book on very basic Buddhism and immediately found that I didn't have to invent my own path. A path was already laid out perfectly by a wonderfully enlightened being, the Buddha. So then I realized I needed to find a teacher, and I'm going to get this going quickly. When I was 20, I left for India because in 1959, of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and about 80,000 Tibetan refugees had been forced into India in the wake of the Chinese communist invasion of Tibet. And so they were now living very poorly in those days as refugees in India and Nepal. And along with His Holiness the Dalai Lama came many of the very greatest lamas of Tibet as refugees. So then I went to India and I was working there in a school for young lamas, and on my 21st birthday I met with my guru, who indeed is the best birthday present I ever received. His name was Kamtu Rinpoche. And so I went and stayed with his community and worked as his secretary and taught English to the children. The problem then began because his community, with which I'm still very closely communicated, although now my Lama died at the age of 49 and is now reborn and is now 29. But the community we are still very closely associated with. But at that time, the community had a monastery and it had lay people, but there were no nuns. So I was basically the only nun there. And normally I was also the only foreigner. So it was actually very lonely because I didn't belong to the monks and I didn't belong to the lay people. And where did I belong? And so later, when I spent many years in solitude, people say, weren't you lonely? And my only answer is no, I was never lonely when I was alone. I was very, very lonely when I lived with the community. But from a spiritual point of view, the problem was that Tibetan Buddhism is extremely complicated, extremely esoteric, exotic, and very, very rich. It's like a kind of Dharma supermarket. There is so much there on sale. But how to find the way in? In those days, which is the 60s, there was almost nothing on Tibetan Buddhism, certainly almost nothing which was valid. And I didn't know Tibetan, I was just learning. There was nothing in my own language. And the problem was, it took me time to realize, the problem was that they didn't really take me very seriously. I mean, they took me seriously on one level. I mean, because my Lama assured me that we had been together for many lifetimes, and that in this lifetime it was more difficult because of having now taken a female form. But because of taking a female form, there was not that sense of urgency that I should be properly trained. I mean, in those days, very, very few Westerners were interested in Buddhism, and especially Tibetan Buddhism. So by rights, they should have thought, oh, look, we've got this young girl, she really wants to learn, let's fill her up. But in fact, nobody taught me anything. I had a teacher and he would just tell me stories, but not particularly edifying stories. I mean, nothing that you really could learn much from. And so years went by and I felt that I was at a huge banquet at which I was being given a little crumb from here and a little taste from there and a little bit here. All it did was ignite one's hunger, but it didn't satisfy the hunger. And then I would see that even, for example, one American scholar who wasn't even Buddhist, but he was male, came and they gave him so much teaching. He was just doing it for his academic degree. But they would spend hours and hours and hours the whole year, every day, teaching him. Because he had a male body, I assume. What other reason? So it was very frustrating. And this is one of the things which we are now really working at dealing with. This whole unconscious, I think, very unconscious discrimination. Anyway, eventually, after about several years, the community moved to their present site in North India, and my Lama said, now it's time for you to go away and practice. So then he told me to go to the Himalayan region of Lahul Spiti, which is a Buddhist area, but still in India. And so I went there, and I stayed in Lahul for about 18 years. At first, for the first few years, I stayed in a nunnery monastery. There were both monks and nuns, and then later I moved up into a cave. What I noticed when I was in Lahul was again that the monks were in the forefront doing the pujas, doing the rituals. Lamas would come and put them into long retreats. The nuns were in the kitchen doing the cooking. One of the nuns that I knew, who was an extremely intelligent young woman, she came from a good Lahuli family, and her family wished her to marry, but then she herself wanted to be a nun, and the family were very opposed and arranged a marriage for her. On the night before her marriage, she cut all her hair off. Now here, in looking at all of you, you would say, so what? But of course, in Asia, your long hair is your great beauty. And to get married with a cropped head would be completely unfeasible. So her family accepted the fact that she was really very serious and allowed her to become a nun. And so then she went to live with a very wonderful Lama, I mean, truly a great Lama, who had dedicated much time to taking care of people in these Himalayan border regions, which most lamas ignore. And he lived in those regions, and so she went to live with him and his family. He was a married lama, he had a wife and children. And this nun, this young woman who was so bright, so intelligent, and had given up so much, was then put in the kitchen, and she took care of the children and she did the cooking. And she followed around the Lama wherever he went as his servant. And yet any monks that came in, even if they, just came in off the street basically, were immediately encouraged to do 3-year retreats and given all the teachings and supported. One time this nun, whose name was Sangmo, she asked me if I would lend her the biography of Milarepa, who is a great Tibetan yogi. So I gave her my copy of the life of Milarepa in Tibetan. And then a few days later, she returned it to me with tears in her eyes. And she said, I can't understand it. Now this is the point. The point is that all of you can read a book. You not only can read the words, you understand the meaning. Can you imagine not having any language in which you can actually read and understand what you are reading? However much we complain about how difficult it all is, we have that incredible, incredible advantage over most of the rest of the world. We can actually read and understand at least our own language. Anyway, then I lived for, as I say, several years in the monastery, but then because it was somewhat distracted, especially in the winter. In the winter, everybody came back into the monastery, both the monks and the nuns. Everyone had their separate house. But in Lahul, in the Tibetan fashion, the houses are made of stone and mud brick, and the roofs are flat of beaten earth, so that in the winter when it snows, you could shovel off the snow from the roofs, and then it would quickly dry up. And people sat on their roofs. It became, because the houses inside, the rooms were very small and dark, and so when the sun came out in the winter, then people would all go and sit up on their roofs where it was nice and warm. But the problem was that then everybody was having conversations from roof to roof to roof to roof. And I was inside trying to do retreat, and it was quite distracting actually. Also, I could only go out at night, because when you're in retreat, you're not allowed to be seen. And there was only one water spring, which was quite a distance away. And at night, that was very difficult. I didn't have a torch. Anyway. So, in the end, I decided that living in a monastery was not perfect, although it was a beautiful monastery. And then I heard that there was a cave up on the hill somebody had heard about. And so then I moved up there. and lived there for another, I don't know, 12 years or so. This is not what I want to talk about. So then, after that, I mean, people ask, why did you go in the cave? I went in the cave because I wanted to be quiet. I wasn't trying to be Milarepa. It was the quietest, most remote place I could find. And Lahul, being a Buddhist country, I felt very safe there. It's also the land of the Dakinis. It's called Karshakandroling in Tibetan. Lahul is the land of the Dakinis. Dakinis are sort of female energy forces who part of their task is to remove obstacles and create auspicious circumstances for practitioners. And they're usually shown naked and wild and dancing. I'm not sure whose idea that was. Anyway, after being 24 years in India, my time was abruptly brought to an end by towards the end of a 3-year strict retreat. I heard somebody breaking through the barriers, and then next thing knocking on my door. And when I opened it, there was a police officer, and he said to me, "Oh, the superintendent of police says you have been in the country illegally for 3 years, and so you have 48 hours to leave the country." So I said, "Oh, right." So next day I went down and spoke with the SP, and anyway, it turned out it was all a mistake. But meantime, of course, my retreat had been broken. So then, as I say, I had been in India 24 years. I felt I needed to reconnect with Western culture, because since 18 I had been completely absorbed in Buddhism and then in Tibetan Buddhism. But I'm not a Tibetan. I don't want to be a Tibetan. And I felt that I needed to reconnect with Western thought, with Western culture. And so then some friends of mine wrote to me and said, "Okay, we found it, the perfect place. Come to Assisi." And I thought, Italy, right, culture, right, Italy, the perfect place. So then I came to Assisi and stayed for a few years in Assisi, in the hills behind Assisi, and it was very wonderful. Italy is a perfect place for really absorbing Western culture, because it's everywhere. It's not just in museums. It's in every church, in every house, in everywhere. It's just replete with it. And so that was a very wonderful experience. I tried again to go back into retreat, and invariably had very, very strong obstacles. Just really very, very strong obstacles against being in retreat. I won't go into it, we don't have time, but anyway. As a result, I felt, okay, I'm not meant to be in retreat, then what? Okay, look, you Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, I've given my whole life to the Dharma. What do you want? Tell me what you want me to do. And so then I had a very strong feeling I should return to India and maybe start teaching English to the incarnation of my Lama, who was at that time 12. So I went back to India, and when I went back to India, then the lamas in my monastery said, "Look, we have nothing for the women. You should start a nunnery." I thought, that's what I'm meant to be doing. The previous Kamtra Rinpoche, my guru, had said on several occasions, "You must start a nunnery." And I had sort of just said, and because I had no money, how do you start a nunnery? So I put that one aside. But now when they said, "You must start a nunnery," I thought, yes, this is it. And so since that time, which is the early 90s basically, I have been trying to start a nunnery. Why? Tibetan Buddhism, like just about every major religion, is very patriarchal, very hierarchical. Traditionally, while they had huge monastic universities for the monks to be trained in philosophy and debating, and retreat centers for monks and other males to do extensive retreats, even up to lifelong retreats, very little was set out for the nuns. Nuns were not traditionally educated. Not traditionally educated means they had no voice. I mean, this is always the problem in religion, is that until very recently, women were the silent, often majority. The books are written by the boys. The commentaries are written by the boys. The teachers sitting up there are male. All the lineage gurus are male. So the image which is projected constantly is that if you really want to get on with the job, you have to have a male body. Because clearly there's something wrong with being female. I mean, several times monks would say to me, with the nicest intentions, I wonder what you did wrong in your last lifetime, that you came back as a female this lifetime. And the idea that this might be a step upwards didn't occur to them. But this is something which is, you know, when I asked our nuns, do you think that males are inherently more intelligent than females? They all said, oh yes. And I said, oh no. But you think so, because the only people you know who are in authority, who have the learning, who have the ability to teach, are males. Why? Because they are the ones who have been taught, they are the ones who have been trained. But it's hard for women to make that leap, you know? I mean, I asked my Lama one time why there were so few female incarnations in the Tibetan system. In the Tibetan tradition, well, as with the Dalai Lama, so with hundreds, thousands of other lamas, when they die, then they look for their incarnation, and then they are taken away at an early age and trained. My own Lama was enthroned when he was 2 years old. He was still wearing diapers and drinking from a bottle, but there he was up on his high throne with his hat on and all his brocades. And he sat there for hours. But I asked my Lama, how is it there are so few female incarnations in Tibet? And he said, look, when my sister was being born, she had more signs than I did at my birth. Signs like, you know, rainbows and flowers falling, and there are all sorts of signs which Tibetans regard as being auspicious. He said she had more signs than I did. And everyone got very excited thinking, oh, who's coming? And then it was a girl, and they said, whoops, mistake. And he said if she'd been a boy, they would have taken him and tried to find out who he was, would have seen that he was properly trained, that he had all the, you know, everything given to him for molding him into a teacher. But because it was a girl, nothing was done. And she wasn't even given as a nun. She was not given any kind of help or training or education. And he said this was very common in Tibet. Many of these women, after their children grew up themselves, then went off into retreat and became very accomplished. But since they had no education and no training, their ability to benefit others was very limited. And he said that's why we didn't want to come back in a female body. It was nothing against females, but because of society. It was it was not a very helpful rebirth. So I decided to start a nunnery which would be for giving the young women the kind of training I never received. I thought to myself, well, how would I like to have been taken care of and trained and encouraged? And so that's what we're trying to do in our nunnery. One of the things which the nuns most lack is education. And so therefore we are educating them. They not only, of course, learn English, most of them already know Hindi, they learn Tibetan, including Tibetan grammar, and they learn Tibetan philosophy and debating. This is very important because their sense of confidence, the main problem in all the nunneries, which everybody agrees on, is that the nuns have very low self-esteem and very little confidence. Why? Because if you go to any kind of function, the nuns are at the back. Even the oldest nun of 80 would be behind the littlest monk of 6. And so they're always in the back. If they're allowed in at all, often they have to stay outside. And the whole message given to them is that they are inferior. There are many prayers for being reborn in a male body. And many of the philosophers, the great philosophers that everyone admires so much, is always going on about the impure female body and how inferior it is. Because, of course, monks in any tradition fear women. Naturally they do. You know, we don't have to ask ourselves why. They don't ask themselves why. And they think the problem is us. We're the big temptresses out there trying to grab these pure, lovely monks. It's not the monks' fault. The problem is that this gets written in the books. And then nuns read this also. How impure they are, how inferior they are. And of course, how can that work on your self-esteem, on your belief in yourself? So now we are working very hard to create a confidence, giving the girls, we have to start by letting the girls do what the boys do. Sometimes people say, well, how about a more feminine-oriented study program? But first they have to prove to themselves they can do what the boys can do. Yes. You know, then later when they have that confidence, they can go on. But first they have to do it. Otherwise they will always think, well, this was all we could do because we can't do as much as they can do. The other problem for nuns is that they only have a novice ordination in the Tibetan tradition. They don't have full ordination. We're working on that. There is amazing resistance from the monks. Amazing resistance to allow the nuns to receive the full ordination which was granted them by the Buddha. And is still extant in China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Korea, but was never brought into Tibet. But our hope for the nuns now is really that we also have a study program. In our monastery we have yogis, Togdens, who are monks who practice for 15, 18, 20 years before they are acknowledged to be actual yogis. It's as if they're like dough which is put in an oven and then the door is closed, the temperature is turned up. They are not taken out of the oven until they're fully cooked. They are not taken out when they're half baked. If you take bread or a cake out of the oven when it's only half done, then, you know, it will collapse and it will be disgusting. If you wait until it's cooked all the way through, then it will retain its shape and it will be very nourishing and delicious. So in our tradition, these monks are not just that they get some genuine realization, but that realization has to become completely stabilized. And so my Lama Kamtu Rinpoche one time very formally requested me, saying that in Tibet we had many yoginis, we had many Tokden Ma. Now that tradition has been broken, but I always will pray that you will reinstate this very precious feminine yogic lineage once more. And so also for our nunnery, we now have 5 nuns in 3-year retreat, and that's the beginning. They are being trained by our most senior yogi, so we are keeping our fingers crossed. And many other girls, after their initial 6-year program, it's a 10-year study program, after their initial 6 years are then hoping to go also into retreat, and some of them to train to be Tokdenma. We need teachers, female teachers. In the Tibetan tradition, there are almost no female teachers. The only 2 teachers there are one is the sister of the head of a lineage, and one was the daughter of the head of a lineage. And so they are also not referred to in the Tibetan circles by their own title, but as so-and-so's daughter, so-and-so's sister. And so we have a long way to go, but we are going there. Now there are nunneries coming up, nuns are studying, nuns are being trained, and also lay women, some of them are also trying their best to do practices and to realize their inner potential. So that in the future there will be, if a girl is born with auspicious signs, people will rejoice and say, wonderful, I wonder who she is, let's train her properly. So my time has run out, I think. But anyway, in general, that's what we're up to. So thank you very much for your attention.